And welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us this evening as we will be talking about growing an equitable community for our children and families, an introduction to racism and implicit bias. I am Michelle Higgs, a programs manager at the Children's Services Council of Broward County, and I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator, Dr. Sue Gallagher.
Hi, good evening. I'm Sue Gallagher. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at the Children's Services Council. And I really want to thank you for joining us on this journey tonight, where we hope you will take your next step in the journey of racial justice and racial equity. So welcome.
So the Children's Services Council of Broward County, the CSC, is an independent taxing authority established by voters' referendum in 2000 and reauthorized in 2014. The CSC's mission is to provide leadership, advocacy, and resources necessary to enhance the lives of the children of Broward County and empower them to become responsible, productive adults through collaborative planning and funding on a continuum of quality care. The CSC funds close to 100 programs that serve children and families in Broward County and advocates for policies that protect the interest of future generations, providing leadership that brings the child-serving community together. The CSC works in partnership with community builders to help turn the curve in a positive direction on issues like maternal and child health, family strengthening, after school and out of school time, kinship care, youth leadership, advocacy and employment, support for youth and families with special needs, and housing and employment supports for youth aging out of the foster care system. So that's just a little bit about what the Children's Services Council is about. And tonight, before we actually get started, I would like for Sue and myself will share our why as to why we are doing the work that we are doing. So why I am doing this work in regards to structural racism and implicit bias is that I understand the need for change to happen because it impacts not only myself as a woman of color, a Black woman in this community, it also impacts my children, my grandchildren, as well as my spouse. And my hopes is that after tonight's presentation, you all will be able to answer your own why. Why is it important to see positive change happen as it pertains to dismantling structural racism and implicit bias?
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Brandy, are we okay with what you need to be doing? Good. Okay. Thank you. And so the why for me, as Michelle referenced, this is a work of love. This is to make the lives of the ones that I love better and my own life better, to stop perpetuating harm and to create opportunities where everyone can thrive. And so to Michelle's point, it's really important that all of us be in touch with why are we doing this work? This is hard work. This is difficult work, but it is also joyful and liberatory. And so be in touch with your why as we go through tonight.
So before we get started, just so we can go through, if Sue, you can go to the next slide.
Do you want to go back to the housekeeping?
Yes.
Okay.
So tonight's recording, we will be recording this workshop. It is also being streamed on Facebook Live. During tonight's session, you'll be able to go to the Q&A in order to put in any questions that you might have as it pertains to any of the subject matter. We will also have you on mute and you will not be showing your videos throughout this presentation. But again, please feel free to put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, as well as if you want to make any comments, you can also put that in the chat function and we will respond to you as quickly as we can. We also tonight will have some interactive polling and questions. And so if you can at this time, you could either go to slido.com, upload that, and then you will enter the meeting code, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Or you can go to the App Store or Play Store and download Slido. And once you download Slido, you'll be able to also, again, enter the meeting code. You can also, when we do get to the polls or the quiz, you can click on or show your Q&R, put your phone up to get the Q&R scanned, and it will instantly take you to the poll. Next slide. So tonight, our objectives tonight is to first start off with understanding self-care and healing the body. We will then talk about Broward's history of racism and resistance. We want to define racism, implicit bias, colorism, and microaggressions. We also then will learn about implicit biases and then talk about developing an action plan for interrupting and reducing implicit bias. So what we want to, again, start with is self-care and understanding strategies for soothing the body, practicing self-care, and being able to recognize that when we talk about racism, it does get metabolized into our system, and we want to be able to make sure that you will be able to know how to deal with any of the stress that you might feel when we talk about racism. So if you give me just a moment, I will like to let you know we're going to do a brief, quick meditation process. You'll be hearing some music. And when you hear the music, if you can find yourself in a comfortable position, and when you are in that comfortable position, just listen to the sound. And as you listen to the sound, just allow your minds to be open to learn. We can be present and still engage in self-care. Focus on your breathing, breathing in and out. When feelings of stress start to occur, focus on things that make you feel supported, loved, and safe. Think of places that bring comfort, like a calm walk on the beach. Think about people that bring joy to you. It could be things such as hearing a baby's laughter, or just seeing a loved one that you haven't seen in a long time. As we go through the conversation tonight talking about racism, just understand it's okay to be patient with yourself. Remember to breathe in and out, and be kind to yourself so that we can take this journey together in learning how to take care of self and be present to learn how to make positive change. Okay, so hopefully everyone was able to go through that process and be able to take a breath. You all should have received the information for the poll. And if you're able to now, just add the words that you feel, the emotions you feel when you hear the word racism. We'll give this a few more seconds. Again, you can go to slido.com, or you can scan the QR code that you see. And so as you can see, as some of the responses are continuing to come in, that one of the things that most of us can agree that we're feeling is anger when it comes to hearing about racism, when it comes to what we feel about racism. And it's important as we process and learn that racism, again, is something that we have the ability to change and the ability to make things different. So we have frustration and anger, sadness. Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen, Sue. I know that there's still more responses coming in, but I would like to at least see if we can move on to the next.
So where do we begin? Where do we begin to understand how racism shows up in our lives, in our organizations, in our gatherings, and in our community? One of the things that's helpful for us is to understand that racism is embedded like DNA in the history of this country, in our community. It's embedded in the structures and the laws and the policies of this nation, of this state, of this county, of this community that we live in, that it is embedded in all of the institutions that we live and work and interact with. And we're going to explore that tonight. And that structural context then shows up in how we communicate and relate to and experience each other interpersonally. And racism also shows up in our own consciousness, in our own feelings, in our own experiences. And so we need to be able to understand that if we're going to co-create equity, that we need to be able to see racism at all of these levels, in all of these pieces, and understand how to dismantle that and co-create something new. This is a process that's been in place for 400 years. It's not going to go away in 400 days because now we have this analysis. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of heart, and a lot of analysis and a lot of courage to dismantle and recreate for equity at all of these levels. And let us be clear that when we talk about race, there is no biological basis for race. There is no biological difference between white-skinned people, brown-skinned people, right? 99.9% DNA matches across people with different skin tones. And so if it's not biological, what is it? It is a social and political and economic construct that was created to serve the interests of political and economically powerful people, right? Racism, the system and structure of racism, created the concept of race. And we're going to explore that a little bit tonight. So it's important to start with the definition that racism is not just the individual interactions, the expression of hate, the expression of ignorance, but it is a system that structures opportunity and access based on the interpretation of how someone looks. And this is a definition that comes from Kamara Phyllis Jones, who works in the public health arena, right? And so we can see here that racism is a constructed yet powerful reality, okay? And what has been constructed can be deconstructed. And racism is about this race prejudice, this appearance of skin tone, plus power. If we're not talking about power, then we're not going to be able to successfully address racism. And that will become clear as we go through the evening. And so Michelle and I have had the privilege and honor of sharing a lot of this work with our community partners here in Broward over the last 4 years. We've shared this with about 3,000 folks. And what we've learned is that we've got to create some shared mental maps of what racism is, how it operates, and what we can do to interrupt it. So what I'm going to share with you is 400 years of racism in the United States in 4 minutes. Wow, how is that possible? It's possible because the essential structure of racism hasn't changed since its beginning. The words have changed, the images have changed, but the essential structure has stayed the same. And I'm going to illustrate that now through this next slide. So what set up the template for racism in the United States was in the 17th century, before it was even the United States. I'm going to take you back to Bacon's Rebellion in the colony of Virginia, which was a colony of the British Empire with a British governor and a constellation of indentured servants, slaves, planters, frontiersperson, and then the governing structure. And there was a fairly wealthy planter named Nathaniel Bacon, who was at the frontier in Virginia and was having problems pushing back the Native Americans to get more land so that they could grow more tobacco. So he went to the governor, Governor Berkeley, in the colony of Virginia, and said, "Will you help me push back the Indians?" And the governor said, "No, I have a very fruitful trade, a fur trade with the Native Americans, and I don't want to interrupt that." And so Nathaniel Bacon then went and gathered a large contingency of mixed race, mixed status people in the colony and rose up against the governor to demand this intervention and this assistance. And that rebellion of Euro-Americans, African-Americans, and that whole mix was squashed by the military and political and economic power of the British Empire. And then 2 very important things happened as a result that set up the basic dynamic that we still see today. And the first thing was that the political and economic ruling class recognized that they needed to protect their property and put into law the ability to dehumanize enslaved and kidnapped Africans, people from Africa, by creating laws that said Black people are not human and they can be treated as property. So that was the first thing that set up the template for racism. It was put in the law. The second thing is that Governor Berkeley and the political and ruling economic class recognized that there are way more of them than there are of us. And we need to keep people divided so they won't work together to rise up against us. And so they began this process of differential treatment for whites and Blacks. At that time, it was for Euro-Americans and African Americans, right? And so the Europeans who were going to become white got a gun and a little bit of status to patrol the enslaved Africans. The enslaved Africans who participated in the rebellion got whips, lashes, right? And this now dehumanized status as an enslaved property, right? And that set up this social division based on the appearance of race to maintain social division to not threaten the political and economic interest of those in the ruling class. This social system was then sustained through the violence of slavery, whipping, separating families, raping, pillages, no property rights, no voting rights, right? And so that violence maintained this structure. And so how did people sleep at night, right? Well, there was a social narrative, a story that came to justify this social arrangement. And the story was white European people are superior and Black enslaved Africans are not human. So it's okay to have this social arrangement and to treat people in this way, right? So the structure of racism, it's embedded in the laws to serve the self-interests of those at the ruling, political and economic ruling class, right? It's maintained by violence, and it comes with a narrative that we tell each other why this arrangement is okay. Now, the good news is that people understood, they felt in their bodies, this arrangement is not okay. That we can't treat human beings in this way. We can't separate families. We can't terrorize people in this way. And so for 200 years, these protests and resistance against slavery resulted in the Civil War. And in 1864, what happened? The Civil War was won, and we ended slavery. So we think, great, racism is over. We've got victory. But what happened? The political and economic ruling elite said, all right, so we have to grant, citizenship status, human status to Blacks. But how are we going to maintain our political and economic status and self-interest? What happened immediately following the Civil War was the implementation of the Black Codes, or Jim Crow laws, right? Where the story is that we need to maintain the purity of the white race and that Blacks should be separate, right? And this process under Jim Crow had a profound economic base where if there was violation of the social code, if a Black man looked at a white woman or wasn't able to pay their sharecropping dues, that they would be imprisoned and become convict laborers, right? And so this process that happened even after the victory of the Civil War morphed racism now into a Jim Crow segregated society. What is the violence that maintained Jim Crow society and the Black codes, right? What violence was that? You can type it into the chat. I'll tell you a story because I'm originally from upstate New York, and I've been down here in South Florida for 30 years. When I came down, I thought that Florida was sunshine, beaches, Walt Disney World, right? But what I've learned is that Florida has had a very virulent history of racism. From 1890 to 1920, Florida had the highest per capita rate of lynching anywhere in the United States. So Jim Crow structure was maintained by lynching, right? And I'm going to tell a little story when we get to the Broward history, but we had a profound lynching here that occurred in Broward County. All right. So again, we're seeing this in the laws. Racism is in the laws. Racism is maintained by violence. Racism has a social narrative to justify it. Now, the good news is that for another 100 years, people understood that this structure of Jim Crow, this process of segregation and inequality was unacceptable. And so over a 100-year period, we move into the civil rights, which were laws that were put in place to end Jim Crow, to end segregation, to end legal discrimination. So we think, great, we have erased racism, right? We've changed the laws. We have a new narrative. We can't discriminate against people. There's something that happened after the passage of the Civil Rights Law in 1964 called the Southern Strategy. And again, political and economic ruling class members said, all right, fine, we have to let go of this Jim Crow structure and language. How do we maintain our economic and political power? And we entered into this era that we are still in today called race-neutral racism, where the laws nowhere say we're going to discriminate against Black and brown people. You can't say it, it's illegal. But the impact and the effect of those laws disproportionately harms Black and brown communities. So when you hear things like the war on crime, that was a Southern strategy to perpetuate this disadvantaging of Black and brown communities through the law, right? And so what is the violence used to maintain these race neutral policies and laws that we have in place today? It's police brutality with immunity, right? Because it creates fear, it creates terror, right? And it disproportionately harms Black and brown communities. Okay. And so what's the story around this version, this new iteration, this new morphing of racism that we're in today? Well, the story is that we can't see whiteness, but whiteness is right. And that Black behavior is wrong and Black values are wrong, right? And it also is highly individualistic, meaning I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I'm successful. What we're not seeing intentionally by design in race-neutral racism is that the policies advantaged the white communities and not the communities of color. And we're going to share a little bit more later about specifically how that happened. So this is the structure of racism in the United States. It's in the laws, it's maintained by violence, and it comes with a social narrative that justifies this unjust structure. Now, we haven't gotten it right yet in the United States, as evident by the initial poll that Michelle did about how we're feeling about racism. Anger, frustration, hurt, right? So we have ongoing protests and resistance today, right? They've become much more visible in the last several years. Resistance like Black Lives Matter, housing justice, economic justice, education justice. All of those protests and resistance movements are saying we still haven't gotten it right. We still have to dismantle racism. So that was a lot. And this work comes from an adaptation of material from Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning and Carol Anderson's book, The White Rage. Part of this work is that we are continually learning those things that we were intentionally not taught in school. And this is not just about racism against Blacks. As people come into the United States, they fit into this structure of, are you more white or are you more Black, right? And if you're Native American, it results in genocide and erasing and invisibility, right? So this slide here just shows you how people determined to be non-white, identified as non-white, are experiencing racist structures and systems. One of the things that has always struck me as I've learned more about this is the number of laws that have been passed in the United States to determine who is white and who is not. Because with that determination comes power, property, status, right? So when Indians from India come over or from the Middle East, there have been many laws about who's white and who's not. And that's because it matters in this power structure in the United States. So to summarize, because this is a lot of information, and this is an educational journey that we have been on as an organization and as individuals to really see more deeply where is racism showing up in our community so we can interrupt it for the betterment of our children and our families. So what you can see here is racism is not about just educating or healing people from ignorance and hate. It is looking at what are the stories and the ideas and the messaging that's coming through that we're sharing with each other that shows up in the media. And what is the laws and economic structure and resource allocation that's happening, that's maintaining this structure. So one of the things I hope you leave with here tonight is the ability to look more deeply, not just at people's behavior, but at what is the story being told and what are the policies and practices and rules that are perpetuating this inequitable and unjust structure. And behind racism is the ideology of white dominance and white superiority. We would not have racism if we didn't have this ideology of white superiority, right? And these structures of structural racism and our beliefs about racism are reinforcing. And so we need to find as many ways as we can to change the structure, to interrupt our bias, to begin to dismantle this system of white supremacy and racism.
So what we would like to do now is just so that everyone can have an idea of what it actually still continues to look like in our communities, is to show this video that will help you have an idea and understanding of what it looks like.
The racist systems set up in our community are working as they were intended. The video you just saw showed the results of the systems producing racially disparate results. Right? And so how do we then begin to look at this in Broward County? in our community, or in Miami, or in Palm Beach if you're joining us from another community? Well, we have to understand what's working and what's not working. What I'm showing you now is a slide of the tremendous decrease in the number of young people being arrested in Broward County. So from 2006 till last year, we saw a decrease in the number of arrests from 12,000 to just over 3,300. We saw a dramatic decrease in the actual number of youth being arrested from 7,700 to just over 2,000. So we have figured out some things that work. After school programs, summer employment, internships, right? Family strengthening programs, right? And we have also figured out ways to better support young people to graduate from high school, right? So we've had successes in our community. We are doing things that are making a difference. And racism continues to show up in every child and family serving system in Broward County and producing the results that you see on your screen. So in 2006, 54% of the youth arrested were Black. Black youth in Broward only make up 30% of the population. They are disproportionately represented in the arrests. Last year, that number went from 54% to 70%. 70% of the young people who are being arrested were Black. That is a systemic issue. That is not the result of an individual behavioral choice. And so where in the system, where in the laws, where in the policy, where in the bias is that system producing these results? And we see this in graduation rates. White graduation rates are higher than Black, right? And there is profound economic inequality in Broward County. Nearly 1 in 2 families in Broward County live on the edge of poverty or in poverty. That's almost 50% of our families. That is a structural issue around wages, housing affordability, healthcare access, right? That we have created a condition where 1 in 2 of our families are in the precipice of living in poverty, if not in poverty, right? There's something dramatically wrong with that structure. And as in every sector, we see that Black children and families are disproportionately affected and have higher rates of child poverty. We also see that this disparity shows up in our child welfare system, where Black children have a higher rate of removal. And we are convening a work group here in Broward to look at the laws, the structure, the policy, the bias, to see what we can interrupt to reduce this disparity that we see in one of our child serving systems. So just to recap, because I don't think we get it enough in our consciousness to understand that racism is structural. It starts in our laws. It's maintained by violence. It is maintained by who gets money and benefits and who doesn't. And it then shows up in our attitudes and behavior. And all of this is supported with a narrative and violence, right? And so the opportunity to dismantle racism shows up in all of these spaces and to recreate stories and structures about who we are and who we are to each other. And that's what we hope this workshop contributes to. So immediately today, when you leave here, there are some things that you can begin to do and say that will dismantle racism, right? I was a white woman brought up in upstate New York in a predominantly white suburb. I was taught at that time to be colorblind, to not talk about people's race, to not see people's race, but to just treat people equally and the same. By not seeing that I am having a very different experience than my Black friend, because I am white, perpetuates racism. If we can't see it and name it and understand the difference that we're having because of our experiences in this racist system, being colorblind perpetuates racism. We also, particularly for those of us who work in the caring professions or in the helping professions, we have to go deeper to see that it's not just about fixing individual behavior, but it is about understanding those community conditions where people don't have access to good housing, good education, a fair justice system, that those conditions need to be structurally changed as much as we need to fix individuals, right? We need to shift that mindset into one of partnership and working together. And the last piece that we can do today when we leave here is to stop thinking that we just need to treat everybody equally. And I'm going to show a slide in a minute that illustrates when we treat everyone equally, we actually perpetuate this unjust and inequitable system. And here's the slide to do just that. So, in trying to explain this to someone who firmly believes that we just need to treat everybody equally, you'll see on the left that this idea of equality works if everyone has the same conditions. If you've got good housing, good education, good healthcare, a good paying job, and a fair justice system, you will thrive. You have what you need to thrive. But what has historical and ongoing racism do to some of our families and some of our communities and some of our neighborhoods, right? Is that it has created very unequal conditions and very unequal experiences. And if we don't account for those, then we are complicit in perpetuating those. And I'm going to give you a few examples. So Social Security, 1935, great idea. If you're old or sick, we want to give you a bit of income so you don't fall into destitution, right? That's a social safety net that we agree should be a part of our community structure. But who did that law exclude? Agricultural and domestic workers, who were predominantly what? Black. So now we have eliminated someone's access to a social safety net that we agree is good for people based on the interpretation of the color of their skin. We also, recognize that there are differences in schooling and in healthcare, differencing in police experiences, and all of those lead to people being in very different places. And so what you see on the right is that we have to account for the fact that people are having profoundly different experiences in this racist society that is set up to benefit those ruling class folks, right? And so I hope this helps you understand why we have to customize, individualize, and contextualize our responses to people who don't have the same conditions, right? And so I want to just share with you some things that have come through our training that Michelle and I have done over the last 4 years, and recognize that there are very specific ways that people who are white are socialized into thinking and feeling in this racist structures that we are a part of. And to the point, we didn't create these structures, we were born into them. And it's as we become aware of them that we have to do better. So I just want you to read through some of these statements that I imagine many of you have heard and many of us have said at some point in our lives. And these statements come out of a place of white superiority, white dominance, and white privilege. And the number one way that white folks show up in a racist society is by being silent, by not talking about race, by not seeing race, right? By not understanding race. We can pull back and not have to engage the pain of racism. That is our number one privilege, right? And as we engage this work, this anti-racism work as a lifestyle, we're not going to be silent, right? It's going to shift. You'll see some other things here too is, this idea that I have Black friends. right? So I should get a pass from having to deal with the pain of racism because I'm a good white person who has Black friends. And the reality is that, yes, we may have Black friends, but we have very different experiences, and we need to listen more and talk less, and really hold the experiences of racism that Black and brown people are experiencing. Another one is this idea of I am here to help. Again, for many of us in the social services or in education, if we're coming in as the white savior, that also perpetuates these structures because it's dehumanizing and it's paternalistic to just say, I'm here to help. And so what are the alternatives? Well, the alternative is to honor everyone's experience, to show that we are in partnership with each other to dismantle this system together, and to honor each other's experiences, right? And so be aware of how these socialized ideas and feelings are showing up in you, in your family, in your friends, and use that as information to say, oh, I got to do some more work around being anti-racist and about thinking about racial equity.
So, what is the experience of being Black in racist structures? So, as a woman of color, a Black woman, I will share some of my experiences in knowing that we toggle between many of these things that you see on the left part of the screen. We can sometimes feel excluded. We also sometimes may feel underserved. There also may be financial exploitation, as you saw in the video that we showed earlier. We can also feel oppressed or invalidated. But one important piece that I have as a takeaway as a Black woman is there's also resilience for people that are Black. Although there are feelings like we described when we talk about racism that expresses feelings of anger, of guilt, of confusion because of the way that we're being treated, we also know that as that happens in the socialization that is happening in the structures, it can definitely cause internalized racism. And as that cycle continues, and even though we may fight against what is actually happening to be liberated from it, the cycle then still perpetuates from generation to generation because the structures have not changed. Next slide, Sue.
Yeah, I want to also talk about, we had a question come up saying, what can we do as individuals, families, and communities to better humanity? And you'll be hearing things throughout this presentation, if you haven't already, that will help address that question. One of the things that we have committed to as individuals is an ongoing learning journey, that we have to continually be looking at how racism is showing up in our lives, in our families, our neighborhoods, our organizations. And that, are we talking about racism, particularly in white families, around how are we educating our children about racism, right? And are we being intentional about that? And our communities, we are looking to find more spaces where we can have these kinds of conversations, where we can do this work together. And so it's a lot of education, it's a lot of conversation, it's a lot of understanding where are the opportunities to change those structures together, and then showing up when those opportunities arise. All right, so you know what? It's, let's see, we are about almost an hour in. So I'm gonna do what I'm famous for, which is to have everybody stand up and shake your body and get some blood flowing. So I'm gonna model for you. We're gonna stand up and stretch. Take some breaths, get that blood flowing. All right. That's good. That's good. That's good. All right. You know, we want to model for you self-care, right? I mean, we have just had almost an hour of really heavy information, and we need to keep it flowing through our bodies because we're running a marathon in being anti-racist. This is not going to happen in a couple of weeks. This isn't a project to check off, right? This is a marathon to transform ourselves, our families, and our communities. And so let's take care of ourselves and take care of each other on this journey. That's really important. All right, so I'm going to bring it home. I'm going to bring it home to Broward County. Most of us, when we've done this training, Michelle and I will ask people in the audience, how many of you were born and raised in Broward County? It's usually less than 5%. Most of us are immigrants to Broward County from other parts of the United States or other parts of the world. And so what that means is that we do not know, by looking around, the profound legacy of Jim Crow in our community and how it still shows up today. Remember, we talked about Jim Crow as that second iteration of racism where the races were kept separate, and this idea of maintaining white purity. So how do we understand the implications of Jim Crow in Broward County? And we're going to start with the story of the historically Black communities in Broward. I'm showing you a map here in Broward, and it will be familiar to many of you, particularly in social services, who identify when you go to write a grant, where is the highest pockets of need? It's down here in the South, in West Park, Carver Ranches, which was bought in 1940s by two white developers to bring up Black agricultural and domestic workers to work along the beaches and in the farms. The center area is the Sistrunk, Northwest Fort Lauderdale area that was created in the 1920s when Broward County political and economic ruling class saw that it was important to maintain segregation to bring in the tourists so that they wouldn't be uncomfortable with the mixing of the races, which was the condition before the 1920s. But after the 1920s, all the Blacks had to move into the Northwest quadrant of Fort Lauderdale. And then up at the top, you'll see that's home to Collier City, which was the community of Black agricultural workers in the community, right? So those communities created under Jim Crow today still have the lowest educational outcomes, the highest poverty, right? The lowest economic status, okay? Because structurally, Black communities under Jim Crow were denied access to housing loans, economic loans, right? Were over-policed and brutalized, right? And we still see this legacy 50, 60 years later, right? We have not yet recovered from Jim Crow. And so what is the history of racism and resistance in Broward County? This is a one-pager that we've created to illustrate the ways in which the Black and white communities in Broward County created separate education systems, separate healthcare systems, separate justice systems, right? Separate economic systems, right? And that separation created under Jim Crow still lives on today. That segregation of economic opportunity, educational opportunity, healthcare opportunity still lives on today. There were many successful Black people in Broward County. John H. Hill was the first Black millionaire in Fort Lauderdale, right? Dr. Sistrunk, Mr. Mizell, Dr. Mizell, we have a strong history of civil rights activity here in Broward County, where the civil rights heroes and sheroes they did the the counter integrations, at the restaurants. They did the integrations, and they also did the beach integrations, right? So one of the things that we learned as the Children's Services Council is we've been very focused on decreasing drowning for children and families, or for children here in Broward County. And until we understood the history of violence that Black people in Broward County experienced when they tried to go to the white beaches, we had a very different narrative about why people weren't swimming, right? And we still today, there's recently an incident in Fort Lauderdale where a white woman harassed a Black woman and her son to the point where the police came and escorted the Black mother and son out of the pool and did nothing to the white woman. So this pattern of harassment and entitlement is still present today. In addition, we had a lynching here in Broward County in 1935. A gentleman named Reuben Stacy was lynched in Davie, Florida. The picture of that lynching, showing two young white girls and other white people around viewing his body as entertainment, was sent to the anti-lynching campaign to change the laws in the United States. Because how could we conceivably approve of young children experiencing a lynching as entertainment and as appropriate, right? And that struck at the heart of many people to recognize that practice of lynching had to stop. And so Broward County has its own history of lynching. This information that you see here was from a oral history book by Deborah Work, who was an African-American writer, worked with the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel, who gathered the oral history of Black people from Fort Lauderdale. And I see a comment here that there's a very similar story in Miami-Dade, and that is correct. One of the similarities is that I-95 went straight through the Black communities and devastated them, right? Both in Fort Lauderdale as well as in Miami-Dade County. And so understanding that history is so important to not going into communities and blaming people for the conditions that they're living in, but it's rather understanding what laws and practices set up those conditions and what laws and practices are perpetuating those conditions. It's also really important to understand the relationship between racial segregation and concentrated pockets of poverty. University of Michigan did a study in Ferguson, Missouri, showing how racial segregation led to concentrated pockets of poverty because they didn't have access to home loans, to home improvement loans, to economic loans, right? Their schools suffered because the tax base was lower, right? Poor job opportunities, businesses moved out. So these structural conditions created poverty and concentrated pockets of poverty, which means everyone around you is also poor, right? It wasn't because someone made a bad choice about a job, right? It's because there were not conditions for people to thrive. And are we seeing that in our work? And are we coming together to be able to change those laws and those policies and those funding streams in order to create conditions where people can thrive? And this is the deeper thinking that we're doing in partnership with folks. And so when we think about poverty in Broward County, it overlays with the redlined Black communities under Jim Crow. The highest rates of poverty are still in those historically Black communities, right?
So where are we now? When you look at this photo, I'm sure that you can think of what time frame this was typically seen, where you saw water fountains that were separated by color. What you're actually looking at here is a photo of water fountains found about 2 years ago in Coral Springs, Florida, in a park by a mom with her child when they went there to be confronted by seeing this. So I'm sure many of you, as you see that, think, wow, in this day and time, we still have that thinking, we still have that mindset, but it is very much real. And it's important to understand, as some are asking or making comments in the Q&A about what is it that we can do to stop these type of behaviors. What is it that we can do to stop these kind of racist type of behaviors? We have to understand, with educating and helping others completely understand the structure of racism and how it's built into our DNA here, especially, we have to continue working together by educating, helping people see that this is something that we all collectively do together to improve, to change. And change mindsets may not be easy, but if more and more are willing to share and educate, we can get to that place. So how do we get to that place? We understand that once we have thoughts in our head, we sometimes know that it's very difficult to break. When we have habits, when we have biases, it can be very difficult to break. So on the screen is a little quiz. I know that I can't hear you all, but we do this when we're live. So just for the humor sake of it, you might be in your own space by yourself, but just read this out loud. And as you're reading it out loud, I'll give you a couple more seconds. So excellent. I'm sure most of you were able to read this out loud. And why were you able to do that? It is because of the power of the brain. When we're given instructions, when we are told how to do something, when we get that instruction, even though you may only have a few seconds to process it, once you know what to do, you instantly are able to process it and start doing what you're told to do. And it can be very difficult to unlearn. So if you know how to read, it would be very difficult to unlearn how to do it. Of course, understanding, yes, things can happen like traumatic brain injuries, but for the most part, once you learn how to do it, like riding a bicycle, it can be difficult for you to forget. So we want to make sure that you understand that implicit bias, as we look and understand what it is, it refers to our attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. But recognizing that most Americans believe in racial and gender equality and reject discrimination in any form, yet stereotypes embedded in our brains, shaped over time by history and culture, can lead us to view the world through a biased lens and behave contrary even to our deeply held egalitarian values. So just to demonstrate what that bias might actually sound like when we're not necessarily audibly saying it, I'm going to share with you a video that gives you an idea of what that actually looks and sounds like.
You're not staying there, right? What do you think she's up to? Don't make eye contact.
What about my change? And the abo barman says,
Go on. It's only a joke.
Discrimination leads to depression and anxiety in Indigenous Australians. No one should be made to feel like crap just for being who they are.
So I'm sure after seeing that, you can understand how our thoughts and what we feel and experience can definitely be something that will impact us because it is something that is very instant. And we all have to work towards understanding how implicit bias works within all of us.
And we had one question, Michelle, about what is the difference between explicit bias and implicit bias and racism?
So, as we continue the discussion in regards to defining each of those things, we want to make sure in understanding implicit bias today, as it is something that is more unconscious, while explicit is very conscious. It is something that we do with the intent, knowing that we are directly discriminating. To give a simple example of something that could start off as an implicit bias, if you're right handed watching this, we know that if you're right-handed, you probably don't realize that we kind of take that for granted for those of us that are right-handed. When we may have experienced things like back in the days when school desks were made, where you had the little table that was attached to a chair, that was really created for people that were right-handed. So if you were right-handed, you had no challenges with being able to just sit, be able to do your work. But imagine your fellow students that were left-handed, what they had to go through. For them, it was a explicit bias in that they were not able to get their schoolwork done. They were having to turn, sit in different positions to be able to get accommodated in the fact that they were doing the same work that you were doing as a right-handed person. But as a right-handed person, it didn't bother you the way the desks were set up. So you look at explicit and implicit bias and knowing that for those that are seeing things in an unconscious manner, just remembering that we do have to distinguish things quickly as human beings. That's just a part of our brain analysis. Our brains are basically going to learn how to sometimes make quick decisions. It's like a baby learning not to touch a hot stove. Sometimes it may mean they touch it and they realize it's hot. They don't want to do it again. For others, it's this, that they were taught the word hot. And by just nature of hearing the word hot, they knew the things that would require them to stay away from. But it took time for them to learn. But once they learned it, they didn't forget it. So, as we talk tonight, one of the things that we want to definitely make sure that we can cover is sharing with you where bias shows up. And it shows up in a variety of entities within structures in the education system, employment, healthcare, criminal justice, the child welfare system, housing, environmental. So, as you asked about the difference between implicit, explicit, and actual racism, we do know that we have implicit biases, but it shows up by the route of structural racism that will fall within these that we're going to cover tonight in each of these areas. I know that we're going to go through it briefly, but we definitely want to at least touch on some of them so you have a general idea of where it shows up for the individual as well as structurally. We also know that when we have biases, we know that the biases can be triggered by certain things that are happening. So imagine the first time you started your job and you may have had to drive a long distance to get there. You may also have had to drop off your kids to school at the same time. You may only have one car and have to share it with someone. You waited for them to get back home to then use the car. By the time you go through all of that, and multitasking, you're overwhelmed. You're just done for the day. And then you have to work and have to deal with people that might be where your biases show up. You could be tired and you will then have to deal with someone. It could be your child, it could be a spouse, it could be a friend. But being tired can also trigger our biases. Being stressed or in a bad mood, feeling threatened, feeling fatigue, feeling like you're brand new at something and you really don't want to screw it up. So you're going to follow all of the rules just because you want to make sure you do it perfect, even though sometimes following the rules can hurt the individual that you might be serving. You also may have to make quick decisions. And when those quick decisions that you're facing are due to time constraints, your bias might show up. And again, just high subjectivity can trigger implicit bias. So these are things that we want you to be aware of, that we all have and encounter in many different times. So we do want to note that when these things happen, yes, we all have them, but it's important that when you recognize that it's showing up, you are able to stop them. So as we look and understand what implicit, or the impact rather, of structural racism is on bias, we want to kind of look at this wheel in understanding the impact on children and families and their well-being. Because all of these systems that you see here, education, justice system, housing, economics, health, environmental, all the different things that we pointed out that we're going to share some information about, because all of these systems have structural racism and bias, it doesn't support children and families to be able to thrive. We want to examine how these structures and bias show up so that we can understand these systems and be able to work towards dismantling the way they are currently structured.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to go into each of these areas briefly to kind of give us a mental map of how we can begin to dismantle racism and bias in each one of these areas. Before I get to that, I want to answer a couple of questions that have come through. One is, does racism come from patriarchy? And patriarchy is a power structure with men at the top and women at the bottom. And I wouldn't say that it directly comes from patriarchy, but that they are mutually reinforcing and mutually combined, because the basic idea is that there is a superior and an inferior, right? And so they mutually reinforce each other. And so we want to understand that if this is about people being inferior and other people being perceived as, or people being superior and others being as inferior, the insight to dismantle that is to truly feel our shared humanity, right? And one of the things we're learning in our journey is that equity feels different than being efficient and effective, right? Because being efficient and effective is associated with maintaining the existing structure. And equity just feels differently. It doesn't feel like there's a hierarchy. It doesn't feel like there's a separation. It feels like there's a partnership and a being in this together. And we're going to explore that a little bit more. And Marcy, we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality in a little bit. But here's what I want to do is that we've got 5 systems that are raised up and have DNA, have racism as their DNA. And so I just want to give you a template of how you can do this work in community, in your organization, with partnerships, right? And here's what we think is a helpful cadence to really begin to understand and live that racism is in the structure and it's in our consciousness, it's in our bias, it's in our decision-making. So what we've laid out over the next 10 slides, and I'm not going to read them word for word, but they're going to be available to you after this presentation. And it lays out what does structural racism look like in education, in health, in economics, right? And what does the research say about how bias shows up in those systems? A couple of slides ago, we showed you a picture of the Kirwan Institute from the Ohio State University, which over the last 5 years has compiled research studies that show where bias is showing up in every single one of these systems. And we invite you to go to that resource and learn, how is bias showing up in therapy? How is it showing up in education? How is it showing up in nursing, right? Or in healthcare? This is the work that you can carry on, that we're just seeding and giving you a structure for. And so what you can see here is that the bias or the structural racism in education is the fact that today, if you look at Broward County schools, we have de facto segregation. It's illegal, right? It's in the law not to segregate. But if you look at the percentage of Black and brown children in some of our schools, it's 98, 99%, right? So it's de facto segregation. So we have that. And that relates back to the redlining and the historically Black communities. We have disciplinary policies that are not restorative. We have different funding levels for the schools. Those are the structural conditions that then when we go and look at people's behavior and decision-making, we see that teachers perceive Black children, right, as less innocent, more adultified, more threatening, right, less able to learn, right? This comes through the literature, right? And are we aware of this and paying attention to how we can interrupt it? We also see how bias shows up in disciplined decision-making. Black youth, white youth make the same offense. The Black youth is more harshly punished, right? And there's a historical legacy for that, right? So what can we do to transform that to create more equitable education? We have to look at how we can facilitate more positive intergroup contact. Practices of restorative justice have been shown to address systemic racism, more equitable funding, right? And a curriculum that reflects the diversity of folks. Those are structural changes that can lead to equity in education. Again, being able to disaggregate the data and use that in a very mutually accountable way. Because the idea here is that we want to create equity structures where differences are valued and not decimated or destroyed or harmed. Similar kind of structure in employment, right? Where you have a history of white people being at the top. If you look at the nonprofit sector, the banking sector, higher education, all of those sectors have predominantly white and white males at the top, and the rest of us throughout the organization. There's also a really good article by Tika Ulam, who talks about characteristics of white supremacy in organization. Things like a sense of urgency, a reliance on written word, and perfectionism, and the antidotes to those. We'll make that available to you because it's those characteristics in a culture that exclude Black people of color from success in the employment arena. We saw in the video the differences that happen with employability. It also shows up in differential treatment in performance evaluation. So again, what are some of the laws and policies and funding things that can address those structural imbalances? We've listed a few here. We've also, the last item here you see on interrupting bias is perspective taking. In the research, it's shown that when we can pause and really take the perspective of someone else, that helps reduce our bias. In the justice system, again, looking at the laws, there's an excellent book called The Color of Law, which highlights how these structures of racism got perpetuated in all of the systems. And in this one, I've also included the media representation of Black men as threatening over and over and over again. That becomes a structure through which then we perceive and viscerally interact with Black men. And so the research shows that as a result of these conditions, these structural conditions, there's more bias in who gets stopped while you're driving, who gets arrested, who doesn't, and the severity of sentencing. And in each one of these areas, there is a plethora of literature that you can be diving into to understand the structures and the bias. And so here are some, possibilities for transforming the justice system to be more equitable, looking at the laws, access to voting, and again, seeing people as individuals and not as stereotypes is a really important way to interrupt bias. Housing, right? The structures of gentrification, the de facto redlining, again, not de jure, it's not by law, but it happens and it perpetuates these segregated experiences. Predatory lending, right? So these are policies and things that you probably hear about in the news, and we need to educate ourselves about how can we create policies that create equity. and not maintain racism and inequity. Lots of bias in the decision-making around who gets a housing loan, who doesn't, right? Folks like the National Urban League, NAACP, there's a group out of Oakland, California called Policy Link. We've listed these references, who have studied what policies will create equity in housing, right? Things like including affordable housing in an infrastructure bill, right? And being, identifying things like rent control. Those are structural solutions that can improve outcomes for children and families. And in healthcare, certainly the structure of lack of affordable healthcare, lack of affordable, the high cost of healthcare, not having paid sick leave, these are structural representations of racism, right? And they then correspond to, well, how do we explain the differences, right? And they result in some of these biases. One of the things that struck me as I learned about this literature on bias is doctors, doesn't matter male, female, black or white, perceive that Black people have less pain than they're actually saying they have. And you can see this in the rates of maternal mortality during childbirth, right? Where the research shows that even if you are a Black woman with a PhD, you have lower birth outcomes than a white woman with less than a high school education, right? Because what you're communicating is not being believed, right? Whether it's your symptoms. We saw this with Serena Williams and her experience, right? So there is a bias about the experience of Black people in healthcare that leads to poor health outcomes. And so again, it's thinking about what are those policy solutions where people have access to what they need in terms of healthcare services, and how are we educating health professionals about where and how bias shows up and how they can be interrupting that in their work. And one of the key ways that we have found this in our own work is around building non-service relationships, where we're not seeing people as clients or patients, but we're seeing people as people. And that has been transformative for us here at the Children's Services Council. So again, we just wanted you to get the cadence that in every system, we need to look at structures and we need to look at bias, right? And we need to be doing those things in tandem. And the good news is that there's research in each of those areas. There are people who have been doing this work that we can turn to help inform the work that we're doing here locally.
So again, if you are able to go on slido.com and you can enter that code there, or you can just scan the QR code that's there. We're going to do our next poll. Sorry, 1 second. And if you can, go ahead and go to that poll to answer. It's actually a quiz. So everyone, for the most part, that answered the 4th choice of address structural racism, counter stereotypes, and tell story of partnership, that is the correct response. And it's important for us to be able to understand that it is all of these things together that will help to eliminate bias, as well as to start addressing the structural racism that exists. So what we do want to make sure that we understand that although we are working towards understanding that we want to have equity, there can be pitfalls that happen when we try to create equity. Some of the pitfalls that we want to avoid is making sure that understanding that helping those in need is not the same as co-creating equity. So what that means is thinking that serving low-income communities and communities of color equates with co-creating equity is not the answer. We will talk about in a few seconds about how we need to actually go to community to understand from their perspective as to what they need, and not us going in as saviors trying to tell them what they need. The second pitfall to avoid is moving towards equity requires that we meaningfully engage those most impacted by inequities. We want to ensure high quality, culturally competent care. And it's incredibly important to understand that it will help us to do that by going to those who need it, asking what they need, and being able to help them with their advancement in order to eliminate those disparities. The third pitfall, we need to examine our own individual and organizational power and privilege and how we may unintentionally be perpetuating the very inequities we're trying to eliminate. Organizations and collaborations who are striving to co-create equity have not reflected on how power, privilege, and oppression play out in everyday relationships, collaborations, organizations, and institutions. This can often be difficult in an organizational culture that values professionalism, the mind, and analysis above anything. So we also want to make sure we understand there are a couple of do's and don'ts. There are more than this, but just to share just a couple of them is when we are trying to dismantle racism, we want to make sure that we are explaining and helping children understand what it actually is, not pretending that it doesn't exist. So don't wait, though, for your children to initiate the conversation about what's happening in our community. You can initiate that conversation. There are great children's books now that are talking about equity, that are talking about racism. And it's important that parents initiate those conversations and that our educators are sharing those disparities as well with their students so that it can be addressed head on. We also want to make sure that we do incorporate activities around all cultures and perspectives, because we sometimes tend to see things from only one perspective and thinking that that's the way that everyone should celebrate things. But we know that it's important that we think about other cultures, other colors of skin, and not just thinking that it has to be a white perspective on how we do things in our community.
Yeah, Michelle, we have a question. How do we as African Americans learn to respond to others projecting implicit biases and letting them know we are ready and able to have an open conversation about these biases?
And having courageous conversations can be very difficult. And it is something that does take practice. It does take us going through that learning curve to know that being uncomfortable is okay. We know, as the slide that Sue shared earlier, where we talked about the way that structural racism shows up for white folks and how it shows up for Black folks, we know that there are responses that could be where, as a person that is Black, may be perceived as being angry or being a power seeker, and a white person may come and feel they're intimidated, or they may cry because we're talking to them about what's actually happening. So it's important to just hit those things head on and recognizing that the conversations, although they may be difficult, just starting and figuring out what would be the best way to start the conversation. And it may be something as simple as, you know what? Don't say anything at that very moment, but go back when you have the information and the tools that you've read, that you've researched, share things like this. Hopefully you can go back to our CSC Facebook live video recording of this and say, hey, you know what? The other day we had a conversation. I thought this would be a great thing for you to watch. Share and give them information is important, but it does not mean as a person that is Black that you have to be the one to educate someone who is white. You just push them towards the direction of saying, why don't you go look into a few things that might be helpful for you to learn? I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, Sue.
No, I think that was great. We have another question about colorism, and we're going to cover that in a minute or two. So
yes,
what you'll see on your slide now is, the response to racism is head, heart, and action. Right. So there is this just holding the pain of racism and what it causes. And there's having this analysis of why it's happening through the structures, the stories, the violence. Right. And then standing up and showing up when it's time to call for that structural change. Right. So as you self-assess, where am I on this racial justice, racial equity journey? How am I feeling this process? What am I thinking about this process? And then what am I doing? So this is just a way to ensure that our heads, our hearts, and our hands are all involved in dismantling racism?
So we want to share other expressions of racism. So let's talk a bit about microaggressions. A statement, action, or incident regarding an instant of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as racial or ethnic minority. And I'm going to give you some additional examples in a little bit, but I'm just going to go through these definitions first. The next is colorism. Colorism, a practice of discrimination by which those with lighter skin are treated more favorably than those with darker skin. And I know someone shared in the Q&A experience that they had as well with that. Racial toxic stress, the kind of experiences, particularly in childhood, that can affect brain architecture and brain chemistry. They typically are experiences that are bad for an individual during development. So let's look a little bit further into what that looks like. Microaggressions. So the Fordham University in New York did a study with some of their students to see what are some of the microaggressions that they've experienced while at their school. And a few of the students provided what the microaggressions that they experienced were. So for example, this young lady, she was asked, "What are you?" And for her, in her mind, she's not a what, she's human. Being biracial does not make her a what. She still is a who. Microaggressions such as, "You're pretty for a dark-skinned girl," as if to say that the color of someone's skin determines what means beauty. "So you're Chinese, right?" Again, looking at the fact that just because someone is of Asian descent does not already necessitate that they must automatically be Chinese when there are various Asian countries. And I share this all the time in our live presentations that, I give the example of when I first moved to Florida and I met people, most everyone made the automatic assumption, because if you had some sort of West Indian accent, that you were automatically told that you must be Jamaican or Haitian, not realizing how many other West Indian countries there are out there. This young lady here, while standing next to her mom, someone approaches her mom saying, "Well, why is your daughter so white?" So again, experiences like this can lead to, when you're hearing microaggressions over and over again and again in your life, these things have a way of building up. So think of like a mosquito bite. You get bitten by a mosquito bite. One mosquito bite, you're probably able to just deal with that itch. But think about, like, after our Florida rains, if you were to go out for a walk and the swarms of mosquitoes that start to develop because of those rains, and they start to come at you and they start to bite you. And now you have bite marks all over you from these mosquito bites. Kind of think of microaggressions like that. That's what it kind of feels like, because that itch does not go away for a while. And if you're hearing it over and over and over again in your lifetime, it can be very difficult. So let's look at colorism. We know the impact of colorism in different ethnicities. It shows up for Latinos. It shows up from those with Caribbean descent, Indian, Asians. And what that basically is looking like, it's again perpetuating that the lighter you are, the better you are. We see it in all the different structures that we talked about. I'll give an example of the education system. When historically Black colleges were in existence, when they started, they would do the brown paper bag test. This would then not allow for students who were darker than the color of a brown paper bag to be admitted into their schools. And they would have students send in pictures before they could be admitted, so that could be determined. You have in the education system also where there's differential treatment with students who are lighter, with getting less consequences for being lighter. You have that in the work environment where some that are lighter get higher pay than those that are darker. So all of these things are showing up also in a structural way, even though it impacts those that are the individuals on an intracultural racial bias.
And this also has implications in terms of physical reactivity to racism and bias, right? There's a cumulative effect of engaging these racist structures that creates a patterning in the brain architecture and in the body. And we need to be able to pay attention to the physiological effects of racism, both that which is perpetrated as well as that which is received. And it's a very real physical reaction to this stress.
So I'm sure you all heard the music in the background as Sue was talking about toxic stress, and I'm sure most of you know that theme song from the movie Jaws. So when we look at toxic stress and we look at the impact that it has on those of us that are Black, those of us that are people of color, we understand that our brain chemistry changes the more and more we experience post-traumatic stress, as it was also deemed by Joy DeGruy as post-traumatic slave syndrome. And when I give an example of this, what I like to give you the example of is knowing we all, as people of color, as Black people, as Latinos, as Asians, we have our own shark music. So imagine yourself, you're in a serene, calm environment, such as going to the beach. You go to the beach, you're having a wonderful time there. You enjoy the sun, the clouds. You decide to go into the water for a nice cool off. And as you're in the water, all of a sudden you hear someone scream, "Shark!" I'm sure I just woke some of you up. When you hear that, immediately your body, your brain goes into the process of fight, flight, or freeze because of that intensity of that moment. And when that happens, it leaves an imprint in your brain. And that imprint can carry on with you for a lifetime. So now you're an adult, you're going with your child to the beach for the first time, forgetting that incident that you had years ago because you hadn't been back since. But now you're there and your child tries to drag you into the water, and immediately through vicarious trauma, you traumatize your child because you yank your child, you start to scream at them, "No, we don't go in the water." Because of what you experienced, it passes down. So when we talk about the impact of racism and how it impacts us generationally, it is something that it is a lifetime effect when we're experiencing it. And it is something that our brain has to learn to deal with because we engage in that fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions. One is, can there be reverse racism towards the aggressor, which stems from being the victim of racism? And we have to remember to put this in the historical structural context. It's about power, right? White identified and white people have the power in the structure that perpetuates racism. And so while a Black person or a person of color may act negatively or discriminate against a white person, that is not reverse racism. That's discrimination. Racism is a power structure, an economic and political and social power structure that we have not yet dismantled in the United States, right? So Black people can act poorly towards white people, but that's not reverse racism, right? You can't reverse this system and this structure. So that's a really good question. Thank you. We also got a comment. Our racial equity framework needs to include cultural frameworks so that those of us who are seen as neither white nor Black can find meaning in the conversation. And that's why this discussion around colorism is so important. And I'll just say that we are all dehumanized by this racist structure, which categorizes us as white or Black or brown. But it's somewhere in this hierarchy that is dehumanizing. And the way we self-identify is not how the system identifies us, which is why we have to change the system to reflect our human identities, right? And our ethnic and our cultural identities. Briefly, my ancestors came from Ireland. And when they came, they were treated as if they were Black. Couldn't own property, couldn't vote, got the worst jobs, no health care, none of that. But over time, my ancestors adopted whiteness to gain privilege at a cost of our Irish music, culture, food, and language. And that process of becoming white happens to every immigrant group that comes into the United States. And so it's important to understand, here's my individual subjective hopes and experience, but here's what I experience in this racist system and structure. So thank you for lifting that up. And so at the level of intercultural communication, yes, we can set those things up, but also with an analysis of how do those intercultural dynamics fit into the system of making us Black or white to fit into this hierarchy. And that's some of the reflection that we have to do for this work. So thank you for your comments.
So we're going to just take a look at another video that kind of helps to understand the impact of those three structures that we just talked about: microaggressions, colorism, the impact of mostly toxic stress, and the impact that it can have, especially on our young Black boys and our Black men in this community.
I dare you. Ask yourself,
I'm asking you to.
When did my baby become a threat to you?
When I cried. When I started to crawl. When I started to speak. When I started to run. When I started to dream. When I laughed for joy. When I played with my toy gun. When I learned to read.
When my jeans were too baggy.
When I wore a hoodie.
When I drove a car.
When I left the library late from studying.
When I protect my family.
When you need jail cells filled.
When I'm less than perfect.
When I went for a run.
When I went to the store.
When I fought for your country.
When I held my arms and my hands high.
When I finally earned my degree.
When I loved with my heart and soul.
When I sat enjoying my coffee.
When I go for a job interview.
When the dictation of my speech was not like yours.
When white women become uncomfortable.
When I protested the injustice of the cage you built.
When I wear a mask to protect you and myself.
When I raise my voice.
When I move too fast.
When I breathe.
When did my baby become a threat to you? When I was born.
When did my baby become a threat to you?
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Bring with the harmonies of liberty.
So I know that was very difficult probably for most of us to watch and see, and understanding again the impact of structural racism, individualized biases, has a negative impact, not just on individuals, on community, but these are the young men, the young boys of our community. And we have to ask ourselves, when are we going to do different? So I know that the question was asked in terms of, well, the color of my skin is just one part of who I am. And so as we kind of take a look at intersectionality and what role that plays here, just ask yourself these questions that you see on the screen. Which of these do you think about most often? Race, gender, sexual identity, immigration status, socioeconomic status. When I do this live, I ask everyone in the audience, go to the one that you think you would answer for your number one. The second question, which of these do you think about least often? Race, gender, sexual identity, immigration status, socioeconomic status? Which of these have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? Race, gender, sexual identity, immigration status, socioeconomic status? Which of these give you the most privilege? So what I want you to know is that you may not even see the thing that you would have answered to the question up on the screen. Perhaps there's something that you would want to have up there, like education, like religion. But what's important to understand about all of the things that are up here, the one thing, for the most part, that you really are not able to change, and it is what people typically will just see. And again, even though it's a construct, because we are all human, but they still see the race, they see the color on the skin. Now, everything that is about who we are is very, very important. And sometimes when there's a combination of these things that are treated negatively, when you have things such as your gender and your race, your sexual identity and your race, your immigration status and your race, your socioeconomic status and your race, yes, together, all together, they can impact us. And if we can work towards the structure of racism that is impacting everyone, not just Black people, it impacts everyone, whether it is to decrease the empathy that those who are engaged in it, to those that are impacted it, that are feeling it. We have to work on understanding that when we dismantle this, it is going to be something that can have a positive impact on the dismantling of all of the other issues that are addressed here on intersectionality. So understanding that when I said earlier, when we talked about community, that we can't just make decisions sitting in offices. We have to be able to think about like this quote from Lao Tzu from China from 700 BC, where he says, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, start with what they know, build with what they have. The mark of the best leaders is when the work is done, the task completed, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. So I know some of the questions in the chat do ask, what do we do? How can we do this? How do we make change happen? Yes, as community, we all are in this together, working together to see that change happen.
And so we are in the home stretch, and the next couple of slides sort of provide some resources. There's some video resources, and we saw throughout in the chat that people wanted the videos that we have in the presentation. When you get the presentation, they all have a video link, so you can access it from there. These are some additional videos that are helpful that you'll want to view with your family and friends, and possibly even the folks that you work with. You know, we have seen, particularly in the last several months, many of these books at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, where people are really wanting to understand more deeply. So again, the idea after this workshop is to self-assess. What is my commitment to ongoing learning in community to address and be anti-racist? The good news is that here in Broward County, we are gathering anchor institutions who are committed and focused on addressing racial equity in our systems. And this is a sampling of some of our current partners who are funding ongoing training, who are strategizing around, you know, how do we address policies? How do we address bias? how do we look at our services and how we do funding. And so we're asking ourselves the hard questions to really say, how can we contribute to structural and interpersonal and changes in our implicit bias. And one of the things that we've learned here at the Children's Services Council, and I mentioned this at the beginning of this presentation, is that when we get into equitable spaces, it's going to feel different than the kinds of success that we have now, right? It's not just going to be about being efficient, check, and effective, check, but it's also going to be this sense of we're in partnership in a non-hierarchical, in an honoring kind of way. And so we want to be on the lookout for what are those experiences of equity that we want to grow in order for our community and our children and our families to be able to thrive. We are partners with Broward County Human Services Department, and they offer a half-day training on groundwater to understand more deeply how racism shows up. And they also offer other workshops. And so please contact them to say, what more training can I get? What more training can I be a part of? This is a journey, and each training is a step of both learning and feeling, doing, and being in community together. These are some references that undergird the work and the information that you encountered in today's presentation. It was a researched, evidence-based presentation, because that's what we do at CSC. And so we hope that you'll find these resources helpful as well. And so from my part, I want to really thank you for being here with us this evening and journeying with us on this most important life-giving conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Yes, we want to end on understanding that we know that it's a journey. We know that some of the things that we shared were difficult, and we understand that this is just maybe for some a first step. And we understand that it is also a process in where you might even at times feel helpless and not knowing what to do. But just remembering that we are we are all human. We are all in this together, and we all can address what is happening in this community as one. So I want to share with you this final video. Hopefully it'll be inspiring to you as it is to me. Again, thank you, everyone. We hope you were able to gain something tonight. If you need any additional information, please feel free to reach out to us at cscbroward.org. Have a wonderful and beautiful night.
Thank you to our amazing interpreters and all of you who could join us. Great job.
And please fill out the survey that will show up as you exit out.